People want to know, why are you still debating? What makes you go back to competitions?
But when I was 14 years old, the thing I most wanted to do, maybe this is a lot about me, was be CEO of ExxonMobil, which was the idea that you would be running this powerful company. There was just so much you could do. Very little of it would actually be good, but it would really be fun. And he had been the one who was massively supportive of the event, that he had found us large amounts of sponsorship, that he was actually personal friends with Adani, the famous Indian industrialist, who you may have heard of from his recent scandals, that he had a picture with Narendra Modi, at the time the candidate to be Prime Minister of India, or the presumptive candidate to be the BJP's Prime Minister. And everything seemed to be great up until the summer, where one of the members of the student orgcom calls me and says, well, he's out. And nothing else is going well, that they haven't done anything, that they want to renegotiate the contract with the hotel. And the first step is trying to work out what's happened. Well, the reality was that
Debaters would do as well. Like you, Harish, you were seventh best speaker relative in modern era now.
Okay, well, Harish, welcome. This is gonna be a great one. I'm 100% sure. Obviously, because you're here, and I mean, if you haven't heard about Harish, this podcast might not be for you. So think about that before watching this episode. But the other exciting thing is that we have a guest, a host tonight, and this is Alek. Alek, welcome to the show as well. I think you're going to provide interesting insights, especially to some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. So I can't wait to get into that. I don't like to play around in these conversations. So I'm going to get straight to the point with one of the biggest answers that, or questions that I had about you, Harish, which is, people want to know, why are you still debating? What makes you go back to competitions? Tell us more about this.
yeah. So I think, to be fair, I did a lot of debating between 2008 and 2013, moved to do lots of judging. And then about 2015, 2014, 2015, decided I had one Worlds left. So I do that last Worlds and about 3 to 4 months of really intense debating, like insanely intense. And then after that, I actually stopped doing much speaking. Uh, I did a few tournaments, partially just because I constantly like winning. And then still had my competitive urge. So I was like, well, okay, I can't win much more. So let's move on to coaching. And then one thing really started annoying me as I did more and more of it, which was I would talk to debaters and I'll be like, this person is great. Or, debating has changed so much from your day. You could never do particularly well. And actually, most importantly, was when I was doing coaching and talking to the kids who finished debating, they were like, oh, we should debate like this person. This was a 5 point matter dump, which was never what I told them to do. It's like, fine, I will speak and hopefully will not be too bad at it. Now, I've done a few tournaments in the last 6 months, albeit before that, I hadn't done any in 4 years. And they went reasonably well. It still feels a bit like, I think the analogy I used, Michael Jordan and the Washington Wizards, which is self-aggrandizing, I admit, but I'm not really going to keep my ego in check and give it, particularly your guest host right now, which is nothing's entirely correct. It's all a little bit slower than it's ever been before, which actually makes it a more fun challenge than it's been before. Plus, very minor changes to what is rewarded.
Yeah. Uh, there is a lot to talk about just out of these few things, but we're gonna get into that a little bit later, comparing kind of eras of debating from your perspective. Before we continue with kind of exploring your overall debate career, going back, getting those blasts from the past, I want to ask a question that is more connected to you, the person. Uh, and I was thinking about what would be an interesting question to ask, and what I ended up with is, what did you wanted to become when you were little, and how did that change over time?
This is going to be the worst answer imaginable. But when I was 14 years old, the thing I most wanted to do, maybe this is a lot about me, was be CEO of ExxonMobil, which was the idea that you would be running this powerful company. There was just so much you could do. Very little of it would actually be good, but it would really be fun, that you would have control or influence in so many different countries. Now, the thing was, as I became older and older, you kind of realize that you can get that from other fields as well. And more importantly, doing that is a hell of a lot of hard work. But it is still fascinating. And actually, it's adjacent to a lot of what I do right now. But, when I was 14, it was being CEO of ExxonMobil. I would probably take being CEO of other major companies as well. Same kind of idea. But that's very much what I wanted to do, and tangentially related to a lot of what I actually do right now.
So, nothing personal, but I'm uninterested in what you wanted to become when you were a little kid. But you're very fascinating to me from a debate perspective. And I think you said something very interesting. You said you had very active years of debating in 2008 and 2013, and then you started again in 2015, 2016. So the way we wanted to approach this broadly is to take chronologically through this. And I think it's important to start with sort of your first claim to fame, if maybe this is the right way to say it, which is that I'm not sure if it's necessarily the first big successes you have, but it's the first thing a lot of people know you for. And it's that run you had between sort of 2010 and 2012, where you had semi of Worlds and where you had the Euros 3 times, finals, all of these things. And I want to ask you about those experiences and what it was like rising up. But also, more particularly, I want to ask you, what was it like losing from back half on supposedly, allegedly shallow motions, 3 of those 4 occurrences, which I described for the audience at home? He was CG, CO, CG, CG, all of it.
Yeah, well, actually, let's step back one moment just before that bit in 2010, which is 2 other experiences, which I think inform a lot of this, which is I had done a little bit of debating in school, but very little. Basically nothing for the first part of my degree. And part of the reason I did nothing is I was really bad. Like, I would go to a tournament, probably went to 3 for those first few years, and I was terrible. And I think part of it was what debating was at the time, which was very style intensive and I couldn't do it very well. The other part of it is I think the way I debate did not work when I was dumb, in that I just couldn't formulate the arguments with the clarity I can now, or those arguments would be really bad. And then one of my friends who I knew very well from school, got to the final of the World Championships in Thailand in 2008. And my immediate thought was, well, good for him. That's actually my second thought. It was like, if he could do this, surely I could do it as well. And I returned to debating and was selected for Cambridge on Cambridge C. And we were terrible. And this was the run-up to Cork Worlds. We failed tournament after tournament after tournament to break. And one of my friends at Cambridge said, well, look, here's the problem. You still feel in every single debate you're in, you need to prove you're the smartest person in the room. That's not the point. You need to be able to win the debate. And then at some point, incidentally, you might be able to prove you're the smartest person in the room. And that stuck with me to Cork Worlds, which was my first major international tournament. And everything just went perfectly in that we ended up on 22 points, breaking third. I was a top 10 speaker. And putting this in a context, I hadn't been a top 10 speaker at any of the prep tournaments. The one the week before, which had 80 teams, I was about 60th on speaker tab. And that transformation was almost immediate. And all of a sudden, it's like, everything is great. I'm actually going to be good at this. The truth was, I was still pretty bad at debating. But got selected on Cambridge A with Doug Cochran, who some of you may know was a great debater at that time at 2 World semi-finals and a Euros final to his name. And we failed to break at Euros. We were the 17th team. And this shattered me. I thought I would never debate again. And it turned out I lost in about 3 weeks. And I was like, nope, I'm going to go and prove it again. And that starts this run of tournament after tournament, a major tournament after tournament. So I think it starts at Koch Worlds, is the first one which you mentioned, which was one of the more stacked worlds in terms of the quality of teams which were there. And we weren't ever very good at that tournament. And part of it was, I actually don't think we were good enough to go further. So when I look back at all of those tournaments, that's the one where I go, well, why did I do this tournament? I never thought I could actually win it. I never thought we were even one of the 4 best teams at that tournament. Getting knocked out of that tournament was absolutely fine for me. And I'll say this, that motion was somewhat shallow, but we could totally have won that debate in that I remember that debate more clearly than most others. There's tournaments I've been knocked out of and I have no issue with it. I have no issue being knocked out of this. A year later, I would have gone through that semi-final fairly easily, as the teams which went through were very good teams. It was Harvard and the Sydney team which won the tournament, but they were talking crap. It just so happened we were talking more crap. And that's one of those annoying circumstances where the call's 100% right, but entirely my fault. But we will move forward to those Euros, which is, and a new partner for Euros. This was my revenge tour, having failed to break the previous year. And we did very well. And we then lost that final on a 5-4 split. Should we have lost that final? In a sense, probably not, though that's a question which I think actually has a lot to do with the meta, which is we're adding new material, we're making everything better, but we're not necessarily weighing against the top half. So I think there's a way of looking at it, which is we lost, and we certainly could have been better. The year after, by that point, we were the dominant team in Iona. We were winning tournament after tournament after tournament. Everyone was going to tournament saying we were favorites. And we did relatively well in the in-rounds. Bitterness of not breaking top, but, fine. We break second on 23. Walk through the quarter, walk through the semi. And the final, it's a motion where we didn't have a lot to say. OG were very good. And while I think I could win it now, I couldn't have won it at the time. Or I could have won it at the time without much more preparation or a lot more luck and probably much more time than I ever had at that point. So I don't feel bitter about that one, unlike my first Euros. So I think for me, it was getting knocked out is, in none of those cases do I actually think we lost because the motion was shallow. In one case, it was because we weren't very good. In another case, it's because I think the judging in that case was bad. And I'll say that to many of the judges on the panel, but hell, we should have done a better job of positioning our extension one way or another, and that would have made a difference to the panel. And the third one wasn't particularly easy, but perhaps more importantly, the opening government team was phenomenal, and we didn't really know where we could go as a result, and therefore struggled to do it. And I guess to me, I'm going to be blaming judges as we go through this and talk about rounds I've lost. I'll be blaming motions. I think people did the wrong things, but more than anything else, I often blame myself, as in I could have been better in so many of these rounds, and it would have made all the difference in many of them.
Yeah, I understand this. And then when you had all these failures you blamed on yourself, how did it feel in the end in 2012 when you finally won after all these years where you had failed to do so?
Yeah, so 2011-12 was a little bit of an odd year for me, which is, we talk about people's debating reputations well was formed. That was the year I was speaking with someone called Jack Watson, who's disappeared into history, but was phenomenal. In that year, he won something like 17 different tournaments. When everything's in person, it wasn't particularly easy to do. And the way he spoke, I think deliberately, was very much influenced by the way I spoke, which is how exactly would the perfect partner for me be? And it'd be someone who was matter dumping like crazy, roughly on the kinds of areas I would want to matter dump. And that worked so well. And particularly at that time, teams really struggled with what we were doing, which is the first part of it is he would matter dump to a level that Matt Cato would find to be impressive, but talk a little bit slower. I remember the first round of Belgrade Euros. I think he literally somehow ran 12 arguments, not actually 12 arguments, probably like 3 arguments with 4 different sub-points each. And I remember all my summary was, here are all the things they didn't respond to. There were like 7 of them. And they're like, of course we didn't respond to them. There's far too much of it. And I think that what that actually all meant is we were going into the tournament, two Euros finals behind both of us. So many tournament victories behind both of us. So overwhelmingly the favorites for that tournament that it was almost more relief than it was happiness. And there was also, and I guess it's kind of the issue as you do more and more debating, that your expectations change. I've never been happier than doing well at Cork Worlds, which was unexpected. But happiness is the difference between often what you expect and what you actually achieve. And by the end of Belgrade Euros, it was so much more relief than it was anything else. I think to a large degree, that was a point where I wasn't really enjoying debating. I was doing it because I was good at it and desperately wanted to win. But winning doesn't make me happy. It just doesn't make me unhappy. And that's often the way I felt about Belgrade Euros and that period in the run-up to it. Anything but absolute victory is a failure. And I'll go even further, which is we were second and fourth on Speaker Tab, and neither one of us was happy. Like we had oh, yay, we won. Here's a hug. Yay, yay, yay. Oh, God, what's happened with the Speaker Tab kind of moment related to it. I mean, it was egotistical to a degree, but I think also reflects in some form the way lots of people respond to debating.
I want to move on to an interesting part of debate history, which I think not many debaters from nowadays have got to experience. And this is, in fact, Chennai Worlds 2014. I'm going to keep the question open. What happened? Why is this particular Worlds interesting? What are some stories that you always remember?
Yeah, I'll give you a tiny bit of background, which is Chennai is where my parents are from. It's a place I would visit every single summer. And I went to one of my first Indian debating tournaments, probably around 2012, and met all the Indian debaters who were great people to hang out with, great people to drink with. And they suggested, why aren't we hosting Worlds in India? Is there any reason not to do so? And in some ways, there are huge benefits of hosting things in India. The potential to get sponsorship goes through the roof if you have a major event which you're bringing to a very big Indian city, but not Mumbai or Delhi, so not the capital city or the economic center. And there was an institution which really wanted to do it. And when I say they really wanted to do it, somewhere in my emails they sent me about, here's what their auditorium is, but they want to redesign it. They have literal construction plans for a new auditorium that they give us this budget and say, we will attract at least $400,000 in sponsorship. That there is this brand new hotel, the Grand Chola, which is a 7-star hotel, a 5-star hotel, but unbelievable. And they want to host the entire tournament there. So these were all the things they said. And throughout the entire bidding process, they were happily signing letters to this effect. They were happily providing us documents to that effect. And we went into Berlin Worlds, where you have your confirmation process. And Berlin Worlds was an efficiently run Worlds, but an austere Worlds. Well, the REC, the Rajalakshmi Engineering College, who were the hosts, had brought a team of 20 people to Berlin. And along with that, they were hosting India Night, where they spent $10,000, $20,000 on free beer, great Indian food for everyone. And at that stage, me, my co-CA at the time, Michael Baer, the DCAs who were there. So Michael Shapiro was there, Ellie Zosa was there. We were loving this. Like, this is going to be great. They have never turned down a single request we had. Turned out that things didn't work out quite the way we hoped it would be. And there's a few things which happened on the organizational front before I talk about the tournament itself. The first was the person we're talking to was the CEO of the college. Now, it's a strange idea that a college has CEOs, but hell, it's a for-profit company. And he had been the one who was massively supportive of the event, that he had found us large amounts of sponsorship, that he was actually personal friends with Adani, the famous Indian industrialist, who you may have heard of from his recent scandals, that he had a picture with Narendra Modi, at the time the candidate to be Prime Minister of India, or the presumptive candidate to be the BJP's Prime Minister. And everything seemed to be great up until the summer, where one of the members of the student orgcom calls me and says, well, he's out and nothing else is going well, that they haven't done anything, that they want to renegotiate the contract with the hotel. And the first step is trying to work out what's happened. Well, the reality was the change of the people from who I'd been communicating with to who was making decisions created a big, big problem. And that continued in the months to come. So we're trying to find as many solutions. One of them was, okay, we're not going to have our unlimited easy budget, but they're still going to fly over 10-ish people to serve as an international Orcom. Met with actually some people domestically who are part of the Orcom who were happy to work really, really well. But once we get to the tournament, nothing ends up working the way we think it is. And some of the stories I remember is they're trying to save as much money, so they're not going to run a large deficit from this event or potentially even make money. No one's entirely sure. But these include the day before the first round, the person in charge of the tournament, the person from the administration, walks up to me and says, "So we need to make budget cuts. Do you really need a projector to show the draw the next day? Do you really need Wi-Fi access?" Those were the first two issues. And we're like, we actually do need a projector. Otherwise, how will people know which room they're going to be in? This is before the days where you could just look at your phone. And even if you could look at your phone, you wouldn't have had Wi-Fi access. Anyway, that goes pretty badly. That the lights in the college were turning off before some of the rounds were going to be completed. And I thought that was bad. But then we were trying to pay judges. And there's a version of the story which we weren't willing to pay judges at all. It's not entirely accurate. What they were willing to do was pay judges in Indian rupees, which is the controlled currency, so you can't easily convert it, and wanted to pay them at the August 2013 exchange rate, which was about 30% lower than the current exchange rate. So every judge would have a currency they couldn't easily convert it to US dollars or anything else, and had to take a 30% discount. Naturally, this led to quite a few tensions with the judges, paradoxically and amusingly led by Sheng Wu, who's not the kind of person you would normally think of as the head of a union. But we negotiate. It was actually great for us in that we can negotiate with the college, that they finally agreed, talking to me, talking to Michael, talking to the head of Worlds Council at the time, Steve Johnson, that they would pay the judges. And they brought about 4 different duffel bags filled with cash. I think it was probably US dollars, it might have been euros, for him to hand out. But while this controversy was going on, I, after negotiating with the college, after finally succeeding, I walk out and the rest of the CA teams all huddle together. And this is never a good sign. So come in and ask, well, what is actually happening? And what was happening is the Indian police had been called to arrest Pakistanis because they had not declared which hotel they were in, and therefore were going to be arrested and taken to the police station. And that was a different degree of crises from what we had ever been able to deal with. Thankfully, one of the members of the Orcom's father was the head of the police in a different state and managed to get it sorted out. But when you are really at risk of arresting participants, largely because they're failing the tournament, things end up going quite badly. And that's just on the organizational front. I guess the positive is, I think we had a very good CA team. We had a very good set of judges. But one story I always love on that side of it was, if you ever look at the motions from Chennai Worlds, you'll see, motions about economics, motions about international relations, literally the final about Indian economic reform. And there's one motion, though, that is in that set, which seems so different than the rest, which is, I don't know the exact wording, but includes the term the jazz link, which is the alteration for aesthetic purposes of women's public hair. And the way that motion ended up being set is the CA team decided, the rest of the CA team decided, what better way of trolling me than trying to convince me that this motion was good. And none of them thought it was good to begin with. They spent hours upon hours arguing about the merits of this motion. My head was exploding. I couldn't see how there would be an argument really on either side. During these processes, though, they convinced themselves that this motion was in fact very debatable and should be set. And what I didn't know at the time, because none of them told me, is Michael Bear at co-CA also agreed with me. This is undebatable. But we found ourselves outvoted. And he did not feel that he could tell me that they'd spent 2 days while multiple other crises were going on trolling me. And as a result, we had that world semi-final, which is not the motion I am proudest of, to say the very least.
After this sort of crisis ended, and you're talking about how you stopped debating for a while and you started judging, clearly to mixed success. After this sort of thing ended, you say you returned back to speaking, and very famously you returned back in 2016 Worlds. But I want to shed light on a moment of your debating career that I think very few people know of, but I would love for you to tell us about it. So, do you remember 2015 round robin, where, for context, you top
Okay.
and
Yep.
stop spoke at 2013 round robin,
Yep.
and then you spoke at 2015 round robin and did not break.
Indeed.
Did not
Yes.
debate that very famous final. So why did that happen? And do you think if you would have broken, you would have won that final with Ashish and FDG and both Joe and Vito?
Had we been in that final, we would have picked opening opposition. Bear in mind, the way in which you pick positions at the round robin is done on break order. And we would have picked opening up, and I would have been we would have had a very good chance of winning. Quite possibly would have. So the story of that 2015 round robin, I actually don't know if I have a great amount to say about that. I'm speaking with Steve Rajavinothan, who is phenomenal. One of the more underrated debaters of all time, or maybe not underrated as forgotten in terms of just how good he was. He had been in the Malaysia final. So literally 3 months before that, had been in the world final. I had won HWS in 2013, as Alek says. And I think what happened at that tournament was we actually just didn't debate well together. And in part because we debate in a very similar way. And there's certain kinds of speakers, I guess, you just speak less well with than others. Some of these speakers, which I could talk a lot about, are speakers who try and tell me what I need to say. And that actually is what's really badly. I can't deal with someone else giving me the case. The other is just someone who speaks a lot like me. So that's at least part of what happened. Part of what happened is, for anyone who's been to the round robin, there are always eccentricities in the judging, which is there are calls which are just blatantly crazy and wrong. And that happens though. And one of the things I'll say about that bit of it, which is there are not always, but often there are ways to prevent a bad call from occurring, in that you can be more clear. You can make sure you appeal to a wider range of judges. You can try and be explicit about what exactly you're doing. I think the way we were speaking together meant that we were unable to actually do that. So had I been I didn't need to speak with anyone better, God forbid. I was speaking with someone freaking great. I just need to speak with someone, I guess, a little bit more, who fit more with my style of debating rather than replicated a version of my style of debating. And lots of those calls, which I think were incorrect, probably would not be incorrect. But one of those moments I always remember, and this call actually wasn't incorrect, is we were debating against Helen and Siri, two of my best friends, who I'd been with continuously over the last year as they were going through their debating journey, got to the Malaysia semi-final. And what happens? They beat us. And that was not one of the finer moments. They are obviously by no means the worst team who has ever beaten us. But it is one which will always stick with me, which is like, no, damn it. How did I lose that round? Really, we lost it because we were good enough in that round.
I actually have my own personal story from a round robin. So the last round robin that me and Roman did, which was 2022, I was retired from debating at that particular point. I went to the round robin with the concept of having an excuse to go to the US because I've never been, wanted to look around. And of course, it's the round robin, famous competition. So I wanted to have the experience, but I was pretty much having no particular expectations, was going to have the journey and then move on with my life. Of course, by the time that we got to round three and we received, I wouldn't say the worst score of my life, but I would say the worst away of my life. I'm not sure if it's round three or four, doesn't really matter. But it's definitely one that really, really got to me, and it got to me so much that during lunch, I told Rumen, we are going to Euros. And I think that's a good representation of how things can kind of change, and I think it's kind of connected to your general answer of why you keep debating. So Using that as an example, what made you go back to debating in 2016?
Uh, this is a wonderful way in which this occurred, which is this was around the time of in 2014, around the time of the Oxford and Cambridge IVs. So Stefan Sorochansky and Helena staying at my house. And Helena says to me, I bet you don't have the guts to go to Worlds again. So this actually be after the Oxford IV when I think about the timeline of what happens. And Siri says, oh, you definitely would never go to Worlds again. You have too much to lose. You will never do that well. You'll never do as well as you want. I'm like, screw all both of you. I will totally go back to Worlds. So I grab my phone. Like, well, okay, who would I speak with? And like, okay, I'm going to message MDG at the time. And Michael Van Goshen, who was a friend of mine. We had done a tournament together, which was the Durham Open. I'd really enjoyed his company. He's a fascinating human being. I'm sure again, I could have an entire podcast about things about Michael, positive and negative. And I message and go like, Michael, if you don't win Worlds this year, we should go do Thessaloniki in 2016. 5 seconds later, yes, even if I win Worlds, we should do Thessaloniki in 2016. And I didn't think a huge amount about that. It was in the background. It was like, well, Michael doesn't really mean it. And then he's at Malaysia, breaks top, second best speaker, and gets knocked out in the quarterfinal. And it's a pretty long drive from the venue back to the hotel. But I get back to the hotel, and the head of Pep University debating, runs up to me, gives me a giant hug, and says, you have a full scholarship, and we're totally funding everything. I stopped him. I was like, what is this about? Turned out, between getting knocked out and that moment, Michael had updated his Facebook status as, he's really enjoyed speaking with Ashish, but he'll be back, and he'll be back to win the next year, which is exactly what he posted, and back to win for Pep. And at that point, it was like, well, I've agreed to do it. I might as well do it. What is the harm in doing so? So it was, I don't want to pretend I didn't want to do it, but it was actually pushed upon me by others, which meant I couldn't really back out. And to be fair, at that point, I wasn't going to back out of the idea of doing Worlds again and trying to do better than what I'd done before. I think part of that to me was also, I had built up in Iona and in Europe a fairly extensive ledger, 3 Euros finals, multiple different tournament victories, but not quite as well at the World Championships. I thought, well, that's fine. I'll CA Worlds. That'd be a way to deal with it. And given that the Worlds went, as we talked about before, very badly, I felt somewhat like I had to do Worlds again. And I had the person who I wanted to speak with, who I'll describe and have described to his face as, he's the younger brother I never wanted.
I think that this is a very interesting moment of your debate career, and I want to make the very interesting analogy. So Michael, and may call him MDG, again, another name that if you don't know, maybe this podcast isn't for you. But you and Michael on the same thing doing Worlds, from my perspective, is a lot about all of those hypothetical conversations of essentially, oh, what would happen if LeBron James and Michael Jordan were on the same team? What would happen if Messi and Ronaldo would be on the same team? And in reality, it's a little bit more complicated because you have to do some sacrifices, you have to work in a team. Individual brilliance is not always enough in a team game. Tell me a little bit about what is it to work with MDG? How did you both approach it, and what were the main challenges?
Well, I'll give you a bit of background about MDG, which is he did very little debating in school, but he did some and was utterly terrible. So he walks into Cambridge in his first year as someone who really is very bad at debating. And this was a time when Cambridge was one of the dominant second, third as terms of the best institutions in the world where it comes to debating. And the other people there are people like Ashish, Ben Adams, who would top the Euros tab, for instance. So Michael started so far behind everyone else. But the one thing he has more than anyone else I know is perseverance and self-belief, which is he would tell you that he is not good, but he will become better than absolutely anyone else. And let's not pretend Michael is not amongst the most privileged people we know on the debating circuit, but he would work so hard constantly that every single morning, this is well before I start debating with him, he would be giving a PM speech in front of the mirror to try and improve it. That after every single round, he would say, well, what could I have done better? And this was a little bit of an odder experience for me, which is once we started debating together, it was after every single round, here's a list of what we screwed up. How would we do this better going forward? And that continued from, well, we basically first started debating, which probably did the tournament in February, then one in March, and then primarily from October to December, January. Every single round, it's like, what are we doing wrong? Why have we not won this round? Or much more often, it would be, we won this round, but we won this round by 4 speaker points. Why are we not winning this round by 10 speaker points? I was trying to work out those kinds of things. I think that's all part of just how driven Michael is. But when it comes to actually speaking with him, so Michael is phenomenally smart, but his biggest gift is his control of the English language, which is, I could say, I would give him 3 sentences. He would understand the idea immediately and would say it better than actually probably anyone else I know in debating, which is that was what he was able to do. And his word economy could be incredible. His choice of language to actually highlight a point could be incredible. And oddly, these are some of the skills which I had and have, just never to the extent Michael did, and made prep with him often so incredibly easy that it would be, here's my idea, 3 words. Oh, okay, you've got the idea. Let's move on to the next bit and the next bit and the next bit. Oddly, the one issue that's sometimes created is we do think in a similar enough way that we do have a very similar set of arguments that he and I would probably agree on what the main arguments are 98% of the time. And there would just be an occasion where we go, I don't like that argument, or he didn't like that bit of the argument, which had so many advantages. I think it's probably better that you strongly disagreeing often, but it probably did limit us in a handful of rounds, which probably did make a difference. Maybe not a significant difference in some of the rounds, which you may well want to later talk about.
Just one thing to top this off. So you have to understand from my perspective. When I was a little kid in high school, one of my first few coaches, shout out to Monika Najdenova and Ratko Nedjalkov. Of course, there are many others throughout the years. I'm not gonna get into the thanks to everyone, but I was barely speaking English at that particular point. And one of the things that I always remembered was Ratko telling me the story of MDG doing one speech every day. And how, like, if I want to be a good debater, this is the goal. This is the approach that you should be having. This is the way of thinking about improving in debating that you should be having. And to have this conversation right now with you about this, with the context of me doing well at debating, but also doing well and having the opportunity to have this conversation with you and have conversations of the podcast, is absolutely surreal for me. I have this moment on tape. I'm so happy, and it's all about how hard work in what we do, regardless of what is your background. So just wanna shout this kind of nerd out on my own and highlight this particular point.
And one clarification to that, at least 1 speech a day. There are days Michael did far more than that and spent far more time debating than he ever did on his degree.
Yeah, on top of everything else that you guys were doing. So we need to also think about this, because obviously, like, and you know what, I mean, I'm gonna say it, like, when you think about the people, debaters like MDG, you obviously think straight white male with a bunch of money. Um, that's maybe part of the picture. I don't know. We're not gonna get into identity politics conversation here, but that what I will say is there is more to that in many of the cases, and we should be highlighting these moments, especially in terms of mindset to improve in debating. There was a little bit more about that particular 2016 Worlds, the build up, the what are some moments that you kind of look back to before the final, and of course, please tell us the story of the famous 2016 final. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with the call?
All right, let's talk about the 2016 final. Do I agree with the call? Yes. Here's the one thing, though, which is people go out of that final, talk so much about it, about Bo's speech. Bo's actually a great debater. We've seen him 10, 15 times. That speech does not win the final. And by the end of that speech, we're like, oh, this is perfectly fine. There is nothing in that speech beyond rhetoric. Finale, though, is phenomenal. And he is probably, in most rounds, the equal of Bo, without quite the flair that Bo has. Finale is very charismatic, but he doesn't do Bo's ability to use rhetoric. But I think one thing which I always think about that final, which is obviously, if I spent a lot of time thinking about it, I know how we could have won that final. What saddens me the most, though, is that we ended up on Gulf, which is that probably weren't very many teams which were more right-wing in this sense, pro-capitalist than we were. And just listening to that opposition pained me, which is the first POI to Bo, one of the first POIs to Bo is, surely Singapore shows the value of capitalism, to which his response is actually, no, Singapore is communist. Total nonsense. No one calls him out on it. Never in opening opposition or closing opposition is there an argument that capitalism is good. It's all about revolution and whether revolution can be good or bad. And this put us in this odd position, which, to be fair, we should have navigated better, which we didn't. The op wasn't doing what we thought the op would, and we're trying to find what exactly we should be doing. And what we did do, and clearly no one can see this now because Michael's speech is offline, or 5 different things just spreading around, when I think in reality there were 2 options of what we should have done. One is do a greater attack on capitalism, but almost just became unwarranted given the way that debate was progressing. Or more importantly, a thing which he mentions in a line, I mentioned about 5 lines, which is actually explaining the potential ways this could be successful. I think I talked about the comparison of Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers and the way in which you can change what the center is. Arguments everyone will know by now, but actually should have been something we pushed far harder. And the strategy should have been, this is a way of getting change, not necessarily communism, but social democracy, bypassing any of the difficulties we have. And we had that. It's just that we were flustered enough under the circumstances not to focus narrowly enough on that one issue. But the bigger thing from this is, Bo, phenomenal debater. The amount of love for that speech is disproportionate with its actual quality as a logical speech.
I want to just ask the question: is there a debate reason for why that MDG speech was not recorded?
He was working for Goldman Sachs, was worried he would say something anti-capitalist, someone in the media would pick it up, and at which point it wasn't worth the potential risk reward. And that actually also happened in our Octo finals, which were about breaking up banks, which, to be fair, it was utterly phenomenal. And partially he worked in a bank and knew every single thing which you could potentially argue for it. Sadly, another one of those speeches won't be recorded. I also feel like his Euros final speech, which he won, isn't recorded, all roughly for the same reason, that he was always worried if he had to argue against big finance or big business, that would not be good for his future career.
So you mentioned your 2010 Worlds run. You didn't have like a very particular goal to win it. You maybe shouldn't have done it. So I want to ask the hypothetical question, and if the answer is yes, I'm gonna have a few follow-up questions to that. But if you had the chance, would you go to Worlds again?
So I would phrase it slightly differently, which is if I had the chance in 2017 or 2018 to go to Worlds again, would I have done so? Absolutely. If I had the chance now, probably not. But I say probably because it's when you start with a hypothetical, it's always harder to say definitely not. But yeah, I would have done it when I was 5 years ago, almost without question. I wouldn't necessarily have quite the desire to do so now. The amount of time and effort I would put in, and this is sadly also true, that my commitment shifted from me debating myself to the idea of world schools, which is a different way of dealing with my competitive part of it. And maybe another way I like thinking about it is lots of people would assume, having lost the world's final, we felt terrible about it. I actually didn't. Now, I walked into that tournament wanting to win, more than anything, wanting to win. But the reality is that any final can go multiple ways. That you can lose a final, which just means you don't come first in a debate, in a single debate. The motion can go against you, the judges can go against you, your position can go against you, all of which has happened in various finals. So when winning ends up being your only goal, you're in a very difficult position because there are so many reasons why that would not happen. What I think I did want from that world, so maybe not what I necessarily wanted from that world, but what I got from that world was partially this feeling of finalcy, which is like, I am done with the things I want to do. And debating can then, to the degree I continue to do it, could have then be just enjoyable. So that was the first part of it, which is it was reflective as the moment of, this is something which I've done for 7 years extensively, but now I feel like it's actually something I'm now done with, as something which is hugely important, as things I'll spend hours of my life on. I think that was the first part of it. And the second was, given everything I'd done, there was always this burning question as to how good do people think I am? And perhaps more importantly, how good do I think I am? And I think after that Worlds, I'd prove it to myself, both that I had the courage to do it and wasn't particularly bad at debating. And I don't think anyone can look back at what I then achieved and went like, this was all about, you could do very well in 2010, but could you do very well in 2016? And or you could do very well in 2016, can you do very well in 2023? I think I'd proven those things which I wanted to prove. So yes, winning is something I really would have wanted. And I would have gone back then to try and win again. But I don't think it matters to me in the same way. And even on the debating level, things have overcome it as more important to me.
So before we get into that interesting conversation, first of all, I don't believe you. I think if you had the chance, you would do it. I think you would possibly do it because of people like Alek that are gonna come to you and they're gonna be like, "Oh, you see, you came to LSE Open when you were the seventh best speaker. Probably you're too old to come there." So once you hear some of these comments, I'm pretty sure you're gonna think different. But moving on to the more serious part of what you said, I think this is important. Obviously, winning is important. You should be thinking about winning while you're doing this. But I mean, I'm no Harish, but I was in a similar situation pretty not so long ago. We broke top at Worlds. We did pretty well. We lost the finals. We had 2 votes at the finals. Doesn't matter, who cares. Thing is, I didn't feel sad at all after the finals. I felt like I had proven myself, and I felt like, most importantly, because I understand the debating community, and especially to having these conversations, obviously, like, people have different takes. Some takes are bad, some takes are good. And if you rely on the debating community to have the best takes possible on who debaters are good, why debaters are good, etc., and you basically rely on other people's opinions, it would be very hard to achieve that moment where you're absolutely like goated, crowned as a king of debating and things like that. But if you look at it from the perspective, was I proud of my achievement? Did I think that I did well and was kind of happy with my performance? The answer was always yes. And at that point, it really becomes just another round that you lost. And once you get there, you don't really feel bad about losing one particular round if you've beaten most people through a larger amount of rounds, if I can say it like this.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly plausible that if I had the opportunity, I don't rule out the possibility if I had that, I would jump to the charge to do it again. I think I wouldn't, but I leave open the possibility that I actually would. And to me, it is if you're going to a tournament and the only way you can feel satisfied is winning, you're in a very difficult position, just because of in any reasonably large tournament of how unlikely that is. It's actually something I said earlier, which is when you get to sit in stage, and I think you're probably close to this stage now, Nikki, you're probably actually at this stage, which is winning most of these tournaments won't make you happy because it's what you're expected to do. Losing them probably makes you at least to some degree unhappy, and at which point logically you shouldn't do them. I mean, that's been true about me for quite a while, and I still do, so maybe logic isn't the way of looking at this stuff.
I will say in the hypothetical that it's 2023, somehow the cap is increased, you have one more chance. If you had the ability to, so I'm gonna separate this question in two parts. Which partner would you choose if you had the ability uh, to ask anyone from active debaters right now? And which partner would you choose if you had the opportunity from debaters throughout history? So you can go to the 90s, you can go whenever.
Go to the 90s. Wow. You think I know a great deal more than I do. Let's exclude Michael from this conversation. He'll never listen to this, but if I don't exclude him, I don't say him. He'll be so insulted by this. And actually, as a semi-answer to both of them, the answer is actually probably Ashish, which is Ashish Kumar is brilliant, a very good friend. We get on very well, has the same kind of mentality, but this is a core difference, which is I think with Michael and I, we agree on the vast majority of things. Ashish and I agree on 85% of things, and the 15% is stuff he'll come up with, which I won't, or I'll come up with, which he won't, which I actually think makes that very easy as something to actually do. So of debaters who are semi-active, or indeed, he's probably not active, he's the one who I would actually happily speak with. I think if I was to do it again, it would have to be with someone who is a good friend. I'm not actually 100% sure who that would be. There are so many people who potentially fit this kind of category. I say so many. There's a handful of people who fit this kind of category. It's actually working out what works best for me. Jason, for instance, a brilliant speaker, would be very easy for me to speak with in terms of positions. Naomi and I have done very, very well, and she's the closest for anyone to speak like Jack Watson, which is incredibly efficient matter dumping, or being stylistically, if anyone's ever seen Jack, stylistically worlds apart, but content-wise very similar, and trying to find the person who you fit very easily with. But, you know, if it's someone who's active, semi-active, or retired, actually Ashish is very much top of that list. Arguably, there are debaters as good, if not better, but few of them I think are as easy to work with for me than he is.
I think this is a great segue to what a lot of people watching this will be waiting for. So I will pose the question. I will let Alek speak first because I think he has a particular opinion on this. But essentially, recently in debating, there was this post. It was essentially asking how would 2016 debaters do in 2023. So I'm gonna rephrase a little bit that question. I think 2016 debaters more or less represents debaters from back in the day, so 2016 and before that. Alec, how do you think debaters from back then, 2016 and before, will favor in today's meta?
So I wanted to sort of post a comment on my original comment because I think my original take was misconstrued. So in the original take, I said something of the likes of, they would do worse because the requirements now are different than what the requirements are before. I think this is true, but I think only some would do worse. And I think this is a very important caveat. I think on average, the average 2016 debater or a collection of all the 2016 debaters on average would do worse. But I also think there are many 2016, the average 2016 debater or a collection of all the 2016 debaters on average would do worse. But I also think there are many 2016 debaters who would do as well, like you, Harish. You were seventh best speaker of LSE in modern era now, or even better, like people like Dan Lahab, if he spoke today, I think would do better than he did before because of lack of ESL bias and things like this. But I think there are so many debaters that I look back on, and these are very famous debaters with big sort of an image around them that I feel would not do nearly as well today, and their speeches don't hold up to scrutiny that you would apply to speeches today. Like, I could give some specific examples if you want to make this very spicy. So I think a classic example is, of course, Boseo. I've watched all of the Boseo speeches I've ever been able to find, not just the big out rounds, but every in around everything. And I've yet to find a Boseo speech that does not contain at least one or two massive logical leaps upon which the argument relies upon, and those logical leaps include one or two sentences at most for them. I also think another classic example, and these were great debaters. Oh, no, maybe this sounds very insulting. Never mind. So I'll just say the second one. I think of 2016, another very notable team that I don't think would do nearly as well today is Joe and Vino, so Hard House A. This is probably a slightly spicier take for many people. But I think also another great example of a team that often wasn't as rigorous with proof. And I think they took a different advantage of that meta where, honestly, they sometimes ran insane shit and took advantage of the fact that you could reasonably prove, well, most anything back in the day. And I think that those are two examples of two teams that I think are very mythologized, which they would still do well nowadays. I'm not saying they wouldn't, but they wouldn't, I don't think, be nearly as good. And I don't think that their speeches hold up to this sort of scrutiny. So this is the take.
I mean, I always have a question which underlies all of this, which is, what do you think the changes are to the meta? In that the rigorousness of analysis, there may well be flaws, definitely with the speakers you are suggesting. I would speak out with many positive views on Vinu, but let's leave that aside. There's an implication of what I'm saying, which I probably shouldn't go into in a huge amount of detail, but hell, I basically said it. What do you think the differences are? Because I think the rigorousness of analysis often was still very much a requirement. If you had a logical leap, often, if not always, someone is going to call you out on it, particularly in a good round. To me, what I've actually seen as the differences are probably twofold, and you can comment whether this is accurate or not. You guys will know this more than I will. One is a requirement of weighing yourself more explicitly against your own top half than previously existed. And I think the reason that's occurred is actually ESL debating, which is if you're an ESL speaker, 2016, 2050 is probably the inflection point where some of those biases start breaking down, starting with Helena and Siri. But if you're an ESL speaker and you're against a native good top half team, your extension is often discounted. And I saw this so many times, such that it became important as good debating for you to highlight what you are adding. And that just became something which all teams needed to do, and probably should be a thing which teams often need to do, though probably not always. That's one of the changes I've noted in the meta. The second one is the level of proof you need, I always think, depends on the intuitions of a community overall or of a judge. And what I mean by that is, if I was to suggest to you that Roe v. Wade, the removal of Roe v. Wade was legitimate, for most judges, the amount of proof I would actually need to suggest that is huge. If I was to suggest the Supreme Court was wrong to scrap Roe v. Wade, the amount of proof I would need for that would be very limited. And I think there has been a shift away from what was always a left-wing tilt in debating to a more left-wing tilt, which means that there are more arguments which require less proof when they're part of the left-wing spectrum, but that center and center-right, and definitely the right, requires considerably more proof than it ever did before. I'm actually not sure I've ever seen anything in what I've seen from modern debating which suggests the logical gaps or the importance of not having logical gaps has changed. I think it's just much more the areas you need to analyze in more detail has changed, or the kinds of arguments rather than areas.
Yeah, so I agree with this, but I think it's to some degree sort of a little reductive because I think it's not. I think the particular place where the sort of necessity for more proof has appeared, from what I've noticed as a person who's watched many old speeches, I'd wager more than 99% of people, is the difference between mechanizing and analyzing. So back then, mechanisms for many people, for many teams, were a substitute for analysis and not two things that were separate. So what I mean by this is a team will, or a speaker, Bosel in semi-final of Worlds 2016, watch that, it's very interesting, will describe how something could feasibly be true and describe the process by which something is true, but not so much why something is likely to be true. And I think this is more so where the main difference came in. And I think that sure, some of the places where you need to prove more is left-wing, but I also think it's not just left-wing, that intuition also comes into like common sense and stuff like this. Like I think arguments were ran back then that were, at least to me, appear right now, maybe this is biased, less common sense than arguments that maybe ran now. They were more debate land. But this is perhaps, again, a hot take. So say this.
So on the latter, impressionistically, I obviously know a lot more about 2016 debating, but a lot less about modern debating than you do. Impressionistically, I almost find the inverse of things to be true. On your first part, which is people would suggest stuff which is plausible but not prove it as probable. I think that's fair. I think that's true entirely now as well, that it is bad debating to do that. And the response is, yes, that is plausible, but you need to show it is likely or probable. And here are reasons why it is not probable. And, common sense there is something can be true in some circumstances and that isn't necessarily true the majority of circumstances. I actually think that was something which teams did do that in terms of trying to point that out, and would note when teams did not do that, because it was one of the more obvious ways of responding. And to the degree they didn't, I actually haven't seen a huge amount more of that. On mechanization, I think there's some truth in this, but actually the trend I see more of is teams have multiple mechanisms, which is not a substitute for actually making the argument. Having 4 sentences as to why something is true does not prove to me something is true. And that is impressionistically what I actually say. I actually don't think we disagree about either one of those two things. I think we just disagree about the degree to which both of those are prevalent now and not before. And on that final bit, which is what is common sense or what isn't, I mean, this is a Structural Reasons podcast, but I often see people now substituting structural reasons for things which are total nonsense. Here are 5 reasons why happiness is bad. And maybe in very specific circumstances, you could find that to be true, but there's 5 reasons for it, even if all well explained. I don't find that to be intuitive. And as a judge, I will probably credit it, but actually find things are moving more away from reality, as in you always need reasons to prove things. Something being factually true is not the same as it being true in the context of a debate, with caveats, of course, which is, a team which gives me 8 reasons why Brexit never happened is not winning, irrespective of how good those 8 reasons are. It is clear nonsense. But I think people are running things which are nonsense and actually have many more reasons for it. But maybe, if anything, this conversation says that what you think of the problem of 2016, and I think of the problem is now, were problems in both 2016 and now.
This is the enlightened centrist take. and I respect the enlightened centrist take, and I'm increasingly moving towards this take. As you know, I mature, grow old, and stuff like this. But
Absolutely.
I think one place where my enlightened centrism will never reach, and this is, and I think maybe I misspoke when I explained what common sense is, and I made it sound like something different. I think the number one separator between debating nowadays and debating back then, and this is because you EPL people did not invent this thing until we came around. No, this is insulting, but sorry. How do you say? Framing of what aspects of a debate have a delta or a change and what aspects of the debate don't is, I think, where the biggest sort of changes happen. And this is what I talk about common sense. Back then, debates were always massive. You always took a motion and you're like, okay, it has very big consequences on either side. Let's discuss those very big consequences. And this is what I mean by less common sense things. Whereas now people say, no, consequences are less. Let's discuss on the margins what those consequences are.
What I find really interesting about that, actually, I think that there might be some truth in it, is back when I was doing lots of debates in 2011, 2012, I was always accused of standing up and, well, whoever's speaking with, standing up in the top half and going, this does not change. This debate isn't about this, it's about this tiny thing. You know, teams would complain about that all the time. As times when teams would complain, teams would stand up and define away a debate. There were teams which would, there were periods where they would say, oh God, I just matter dumped, or my partner just matter dumped, which we did, or that all I would ever do was weigh and frame. And I always find this interesting because every single one of these criticisms are criticisms, I either was subject to or made myself about what other individuals did. And I do think there's some fairness in that. And I think what's probably you're pointing that out is often things which are path breaking at the start become very common sense and commonplace as things move on, which is there are plenty of speakers who would be saying, there's some speakers at least, in 2010, 2011, 2012, and definitely 2016, who would be like, well, is this actually a change? And there were going to be speakers who either came to that as the years went on themselves, or came to it because they heard other people do it. And Dan Lahav would do this all the time. So probably is actually one of those people who's actually the vanguard of that and make that very explicit, that other people followed that and realized that is something which you can respond with. Well, what happens when that's something you can respond with? Obviously, you need to respond to the response, and the best way to respond to the response is to make sure your argument is robust to it. And certainly, I think that is part of the way in which debating evolves, which is there are problems in what people do. There were always people pointing these out, but more and more people point it out, maybe because, again, they come to it themselves or someone else who is prominent in their own debating community or the international debating community does that very explicitly. And I think that's certainly part of, that could be an explanation for it. I think it's probably correct in terms of what you're saying, though you are overstating the point.
Can I just say something very quick? This is a meta thing. Yes, I overstate these points, but and I've always said this. Anybody who asks me, is this take really 100%? I say the reason I overstate it is because the old guys come in and they say, back in my day, it was so good. You don't even do it so much, but there are many people who do this thing, and they come in, they say, nowadays everything is terrible. People are spamming. These people would get killed in my day. People wouldn't drop around if they spoke now. And I feel I need to counter these people with the reverse.
And the irony is, given that you're saying that people used to overstate your point, exactly what you are now doing for effect.
No. This is legit verbatim things I've heard by very good debaters who I'll not name. They say things like Tekweitan could be pro-arming Euros and he would not drop a single point across the entire 9 rounds of Euros. He would win every single one first all the time and he would win the final. A real take I've heard about how old debating compares to current debating. Or the classic debating peaked in 2014 and it was never as good. Another one I've heard.
Debating peaked in 20... That's a random year to choose, but fair enough.
My question is, if you would say that there has been some evolution towards debating, the connotation of the word evolution sometimes suggests better. So do you think, so obviously like it's a complete conversation, is it better? But um, would you say that even if there are some problems that debating has right now that were not present back in the day, is debating overall better and is it moving in the right direction, with the caveat that there are some things that we can maybe go back to history and say, no, this is a little bit better, we should continue doing that?
I have an odd way of questioning this, which is, what do we mean by debating here? As in, who are we talking about, right? Are we talking about the top debaters? Are we talking about the bottom of the top of the middle, or the median debater? And here's what's definitely true, which is the increased number of resources, the increased number of institutions attending, means the median debater has been improving constantly since I started debating, which is, I remember time in 2011, 2012, where it was unfathomable that Jack and I would be dropping points to all but the top teams. It's not that they were bad, it's just there was just such a big gap. Well, that gap is definitely narrowed because there are lots of reasons why that median debater has got considerably better than they were before. In terms of evolution, in some ways it evolves, in some ways it devolves. And by that I mean, it's almost accepting what you're saying, Nikki, which is, I think, on an argument front, some arguments are going to be more robust in certain ways than they were before. I think Alek does give the example that more people are cognizant of proving tipping points than they otherwise would. Here's the flip side of it, though, that I think often arguments now from many debaters, though again, absolutely not all, will be less well explained because the substitution is for number of reasons over quality of reasons, or to the degree that isn't the substitute, there is often going to be an increase in speed to a way which doesn't necessarily make it very compelling, not to an outside audience, because I think you probably have to go back a long, long way to find a non-debater who would find most debates to be interesting or enjoyable, but even to the interested university student, would they be able to comprehend and follow what is happening without taking notes? And I actually think that is a fairly large loss. But the bigger loss when it comes to style, and actually I think I've talked to two people where their own style are probably different than the majority of debaters, sometimes at the top level, but definitely at the middle level, is that when you aren't slowing down, when you're not enunciating, when you're not actually pushing your point, actually you're losing the impact of that argument or that sentence which is actually being made. If I wrote down every single word someone said, you probably don't lose any of that. But who can write down every single word someone is saying in a debate? Unless you're talking outrageously slowly, which no one does. I don't even think I could transcribe either one of your speeches with any degree of fidelity. But here's the big thing. When I'm looking back at what I'm remembering from your speeches, if you haven't changed what you were doing stylistically, you are now reliant on my memory of what you said and my tracking of what you said. And that is never going to be perfect. And I actually think that is a huge loss in the ability of people to be compelling, and actually then the quality of debating, because what does a judge remember from what someone has said?
To be fair, I do think that, so there are two parts of this. The first part is, I think, for the worse or for the better, some judges, a lot of judges have adapted to kind of being good at tracking very meticulously debates. And I think this is kind of like, I'm not sure if it's a good or bad thing, because it then allows the speakers to obviously not do the things that you're saying, which I find important. At the same time, I would say that there are speakers who still try to do those particular things. In fact, you know what? I mean, I'm going to say I think I'm one of those speakers, which, I mean, for the better or for worse, honestly, I probably can't speak as fast as Matt Kaito even if I wanted to. But to be fair, I do kind of try to implement that strategy, even if like I have my own quirks with it. So the question here is, the broader question is the reverse, which is, and I want to start with Harish, and then we're gonna hear Alek's take on this. How would 2023 debaters do in 2016? And I mean, to put the conversation in context, we're obviously talking about like uh, teams that have been from like this year's World Finals, last year, the year before that. So let's say the last three World Finals, and some teams that didn't make it there but were still considered quite good. Some of the best speakers that participated. You probably are aware of most of them, so you can kind of bridge the gap between these two things.
Yeah, just one word on the style thing. Actually, I don't know if you remember, we had a conversation at Worlds related to this when I was praising your style as one of the few debaters I enjoyed listening to and wish more people emulated you. But I add that was after I gave you a second to Naomi, who was speaking, as she would tell me later, faster than she normally does because she knew I would track it. Which, you know, it is sad because both of those things are true. And yet I was still like, damn it, I much prefer the style we were getting from you in that debate. But I think that actually just speaks to the median debater rather than necessarily. There are always going to be people who are different at the top. Actually, across the debating spectrum, will speak in different ways than what I think the norm increasingly has. And maybe quality of judges, definitely they have to track better. Still not sure many track very well. But let's talk about those 23 debaters in 2016. And let's make this a tiny bit easier. Let's take away any issues about ESL or EFL bias, which certainly did exist during that time. Probably less so than they existed in 2011, 12, 13. So I think it is starting to get to that inflection point. And certainly I think loosens even more in 2017 and by 2018, even to the degree it still did exist then and continues to exist. How would they do? I think very much depends on the speakers we are talking about. And I love both of them deeply. But so let's talk about Matt and Naomi, who are two speakers who are excellent, but they talk very quickly. And that's something which I think questionably would not work with many judges in 2016, absent, and I think both of them could do this, a change in the way they spoke. And the natural inclination for that is it is much easier. You could track, if I'm talking slowly, you could track a fast speech. You could track my speech. Very simple. It should be easier to track a slow speech. If there is a limit to how fast you can track, there is a limit to how fast you can track. And I realized this from when I would go to something called the Inner Temple Ivy, which was always going to be judged by old barristers. So people who would do debating. There would be world champions from the early 2000s judging in 2011. And they would always complain about the speed of the speeches. They're complaining the speed of my speeches. I probably talk slightly slower now than I did then, but I definitely talk so much slower than Matt would, for instance. And I think you would need to adapt to be able to deal with that. And that's one group of speakers. And certainly some of the absolute best speakers now, and people who have incredible content, and indeed probably speakers who I give disproportionately large number, I don't actually know disproportionately, but a large number of wins to. But let's take other kinds of speakers and see what they potentially would do. So let's look at you and Rumin. How would you do in 2016? Here's the one thing I would note. One of the things which has changed is the amount of rebuttal speakers potentially need to do, which is you can win. Debating is in essence very simple, right? In that you need to show that on balance, your side of the debate is correct. Your team has done the most to do that. The way in which you do so is a combination of characterization, framing, rebuttal, constructive. And the weighing of those three, as in how much people do, changes from year to year. 2016, I think there'll be speakers who do so much more weighing to position their extension or position their material, which is certainly a way of proving that on balance your side of the debate is correct, but probably do considerably less rebuttal than otherwise would. And that is logically fine, but I don't think it would fly as well in 2016 amongst most judges. So I think that might be a difference which lots of teams actually would need to change and be able to deal with. But again, I don't think it's a big change. You get people debate in the way that they're rewarded to debate. If you can weigh very effectively and therefore not need to respond as much, and that's what's going to be rewarded, absolutely, that's something teams will be doing. And in 2016, you would get rewarded for that, but you would also get punished much more for not using more responsiveness. And actually, if I think about lots of those top teams, that would be a problem they will run into. Some teams now are probably going to be slightly more immune from it. Sometimes, and I haven't seen enough of them, I think Ateneo speakers, for instance, do more responsive and less weighing. Successfully, unsuccessfully, I think that depends to some degree on them. But I do think it would have to change those components of what actually matters for people to be successful. But I think most debaters would be able to do that, and others would just need to slow down.
Alek, take it away.
Again, Harish, you're going for the softballs, man. Yes, I think inarguably Matt and Naomi would maybe not do as well so much in 2016, but I think it's a bit. There's a bit greater of a style of both case building, case positioning that I think you're saying. And the example you use here is, and I don't know if this was ESL bias back in the day, but I'm sure it wasn't all ESL bias. I'm sure it was also a style. I think the speaker that is most influential to how speakers speak today, maybe second most, probably the most, who I think is the best speaker of all time, Dan Lahav. Like, I don't think it's Danny Dubois. I think, how do you say? I think he got robbed. And I look back and I watch these debates. I think he got robbed so often, him and Ayal, like before 2016 and before this. I could not believe it. To me, the call was evidently that they win or that they score comparatively better than they do, but the positioning was always different. And I think far more speakers debate like Dan and Ayal do than like other speakers do, because I think there is surely a stylistic difference than, for example, Dan and Ayal and other teams. Like, I think you are again, you had a very advanced style for your time in this and stuff, but you're still like one of the most advanced speakers for your time. There were so many other people who scored higher who didn't have these sorts of styles, and so I think speakers today would do worse in 2023, not just Matt and Naomi.
So can I just say one thing which I think is actually really interesting about this, about Dan and Ayal, and maybe Ayal said this, I'm sure Dan would, which is, I think there's a difference in the kinds of styles you need to use based on the skill sets you have, which is, if you think about like some of the first really successful ESL debaters, so Helena and Siri, what they were doing was actually very similar to EPL debaters, which is they are matter dumping. And Tim also very much matter dumps. Dan and Ayal, though, would do both. And I think there's actually one of those misconceptions, which is, Dan and Ayal would be really frame heavy. Sometimes they were. But God, could they matter dump and cover so much material as well. I think this often might just depend on the rounds in which you see them. Of the top 5 speaks I have given at major international tournaments, 4 of them went to Dan, which is a way of saying I actually respect a lot of that, but actually lots of those had far more content. Would they do worse? Well, here's the thing, right? Like in 2016, Dan and Ayal are still in the fairly early stage of their debating career, right? They had got to Euros final, admittedly, but I met Dan a year and a half before that, where he was still learning. Met Ayal a year before that, where they were a good but not great team. 2017, they were definitely robbed. As I said, I'm not saying about any specific round, but they were one of the best teams of the tournament and didn't do particularly well. But that happens. By 2018, they were doing phenomenally well. Amongst one of the best performances at Worlds, at least in the in-rounds. So I'm not sure it's entirely true that style of debating wouldn't have been rewarded. I actually think it often was rewarded. But here's the thing, which is following from what I said before, which is you will not get rewarded just with that style unless you are very, very good at it
unless there's also quite a lot of content being dumped at the same time, and particularly more responsiveness, direct responsiveness, than would otherwise be the case.
And I think that there's maybe another, maybe slight nuance about the style and the necessity of how you had to run that style more so back then. Because I think the difference between 2018 and like 2016 is, yes, they were better, especially I think between 2017 and 2016. I thought they were quite a bit better. But I don't think they were so much better in this certain way. But I think rep had built up and stuff like this, which mitigated the sort of this amount of robbery. So I think this style could have flown back then, but I think you needed a degree of sort of rep to pull it off, because this style is like, it fundamentally requires response. You're saying, okay, all of these teams, maybe they're not so important, all of these things. And I know that they matter dumped a lot. I don't think they just framed, but even in the way that they engage with matter dumping, more weighing heavy, all of this in down speeches, this requires a degree of rep to pull off. That if teams came back with no rep now, I don't think they would be able to pull this thing off.
Oh, I mean, I think this is often true, right? Which is, we talk about like what a meta is. And the reality is, if you are really good at a different style of debating, you will by and large be rewarded in most of the modern era. So let's say from 2010 to now, if you are really good at what you are doing, with some exceptions, you will be rewarded. But absolutely, if you are trying to do something slightly different, without rep, you need the judge who is open towards it. 2017 becomes a bit of a weird year there, because I think they probably already had a degree of their rep, and things just, for whatever reason, I say degree of their rep, they had done phenomenally well at the Euros. Before that, admittedly, they got knocked out in the quarter. Seems to be an unfortunate pattern for a team that great to continuously lose in quarters. But like Dan was second on speaker tab, IR would have been fourth or fifth or something along those lines. They were probably going into that Euros considered to be the best European team.
Part of what was, But certainly, I think the situation is a tiny bit more complicated. But I think what you're saying is true, that if you're trying to change a style, rep helps a great deal. It's not always going to be rep. I mean, I think we basically just concluded that rep really helps when you are trying to change, do something different than what dominant debating is.
Yeah, I think at the end of this conversation, to kind of seal it off, what's important to say is, and we've highlighted a little bit throughout the conversation, is the fact that most of these speakers, I mean, I don't know each world finalist story, but I know most of them. And it's the fact that it was a lot about hard work, perseverance, and falling in love with the game. In that context, I think that we have to give the benefit of the doubt to everyone and kind of see how they would do in a certain era. And I'm sure that whatever the era requires of them, they've already proven that they're speakers who would sacrifice a lot to be the best that they can in order to perform the best that they could in any particular era. And this is something that we should not take away from any of these debaters. I think Matt and Naomi gave them a lot of shit for their style, but I think I'm pretty sure, because I know personally how driven both of them are, and of course this goes for every other debater, they are going to do as much as they can to adapt their style to what is needed for the particular era. And I'm sure that they're going to be speaking maybe in a way that Harish and I like a little bit better, because I also would agree. I would love to be able to follow the speech without practicing it for years in order to be able to and have fun with the rounds. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this conversation. I want to move to more spicy topics, if this was not spicy enough for you. The first question that I have is, who do you think is the most underrated debater throughout history?
One of the difficulties with this is the difference between being underrated and being forgotten, and that so many great speakers have now just been forgotten. And that's partially because there aren't that many recordings of them, or partially because their partners were really great. And I'm going to give you just a few people who jump out as forgotten, and other people who are clearly not forgotten, but still underrated. Amongst one of my favorite debaters was the winner of Chennai Worlds, Ben Sprung-Kaiser, who was part of a team with Josh Suffolk, also phenomenal, also probably doesn't get the due he does, at least in international debating. But here's the thing about Ben, which is there may be 5 speeches max of his recorded online. He did in his entire debating career, I think, 9 tournaments at university. In that time, not only did he win Worlds and was 4th best speaker, he was also won after nationals, topped the tab at Cambridge and the Yale Ivy, which is and had another Worlds break, which is for 9 tournaments, at the very least, pretty damn impressive. And what he was really good at, and one of the reasons I think partially he's underrated, is just how little he actually did, which I think in some ways is a positive rather than a negative, if you really think about it. But what's great about him was both that he was stylistically good, but he was coming into this as a economist who would think about things in a really economic way, and was maybe appeal specifically to me, but actually I think just one of the best speakers I've ever seen. And one thing I was thinking about Chennai Worlds is, for all things which went badly, the team which debated material-wise most of what I appreciated was the team which won the debate. So he's one of those people who's forgotten. But I think there's another set of people who are underrated because of who they speak with, which is you speak with a phenomenal partner. It is so easy to forget how good that other partner is. And I think we all know that what you're doing when you are assessing a debater, particularly when you're not part of the team, is you're looking at the output. Well, that doesn't tell you how good that person would actually be without that partner. What actually happened in prep. And often when we look back at debates, we focus so much on one speech that we forget the other. And to give just some examples of this, which is, start with Sheng Wu, possibly in my mind, the greatest debate of all time, but definitely up there. Jonathan Leader Maynard, his partner, incredible speaker, won't get anywhere near the attention that Sheng Wu does, maybe because his speeches or some of the recorded speeches don't necessarily have the immediate reason to jump out at you as impressive. But listen to them, you'll realize how phenomenal they are. Going further forward, thinking about Dan and Ayal, which is Dan, again, one of the greatest speakers of all time. Some could say the greatest, and definitely up there. Ayal was also phenomenal. And people will tell you he's very good. Not many people will say that he is amongst the absolute greatest of all time. To my mind, I will struggle to find any speaker who's, at least any non-native speaker, who would easily be comparable to him other than Dan. That he might be the second greatest ESL speaker of all time. And at the same time, people won't put him on that list. I actually imagine lots of people now wouldn't even think of him as the second best of all time. But he was phenomenal and maybe overshadowed by Dan. Even if we go now, think about some other teams right now. Miguel, which is Naomi, absolutely great. I think often Max Rosen doesn't get the credit he gets as being both incredibly smart and when he's on his game can be so good in terms of both his knowledge base and his ability to construct arguments. And that'll be my just general tenor of this, that we often are going to be forgetting those speakers, and we're going to underrate those speakers who are speaking with partners who may be better, may not be better, but definitely overshadow them in the way in which a community responds to speakers. And that's often underrates their talent as speakers, and certainly I think probably their actual role to the team. I mean, I feel, Mickey, you might even fall within that category, but I feel that's a separate conversation altogether.
So we went through being nice. Now let's not be so nice. Who do you think are, conversely, most overrated speakers, both from before and from now?
Oh, can I say Rumen? Okay. I've actually got a general point about this, which is, here's the thing, which is anyone who you think of at any point of time as really brilliant probably was very good. Very few of them are as good as you actually think they are. And unfortunately, that includes me at various points, which is this, which is when it comes to how we assess people as a community overall, there's lots of reasons why we really screw up at doing it. The first part is lots of people are really very bad at working out what is winning debating. This is what is seemingly good debating. And watching it back 5 years later, when you've got more experience, you'll realize you were wrong. The second part of that is the obvious one, which is what someone actually does. It shows you the output, it doesn't show you the input. So people who are really good at delivering speeches, well, who actually wrote those speeches? How much did that partner contribute? Often missing as well. And finally, no matter how good someone is, they are going to have lots of bad speeches, which we are often going to be forgetting. So I actually think, almost without exception, at any given time, the speakers who are most highly thought of are radically the most overrated. And just think through some examples of that, which is, I just told that both of these people might be the greatest speaker of all time. Shen Wu Li, though, was after that Koch speech, and probably for years after, grossly overrated. He wasn't as good as people thought he was, notwithstanding what I think I could say about that speech. Dan, absolutely brilliant. I mean, I gave the man a 91 at Euros. Definitely overrated at various points from how good he actually was. If you think about Tin, incredible speaker, probably overrated exactly for the same reason. And, you know, when people talk about Rubin, they'll think about that 90. Well, okay, great. Hell, I gave him 2 86s at Worlds. Phenomenal speaker. But not all the speeches were that good. And I think that's kind of the reason why people become overrated, which is they get so much praise from what is actually a misleading set of evidence. And I'll say this, MDG. The way I always explain MDG to people is this, which is he might be the greatest of all time, but nowhere near as good as he thought he was, which is, and I actually think for some speakers, that's just definitively the case, which is anyone who is really highly thought of, particularly the moment where they are most highly thought of, is almost certainly going to be massively overrated from what they were actually able to generally produce. And there are so many people, I say so many people, 10 plus people in that actual group. Hopefully none of them are offended. I think most of them should actually realize, probably agree with what I'm saying is true.
Okay, so how about speakers from nowadays? Who do you think is overrated? That was part of Alex's question, so I have to dig in a little bit.
From people nowadays, actually, there are quite a few of those people end up being from, I mean, you know, so who are, well, maybe I'll ask this question. Who do you think are the most highly rated speakers right now? And the reason I ask this is, you know, opinions are so heterogeneous. As the person I think will be amongst the best may not be the person you think's amongst the best, or the median member of the community thinks is the best. So who do you imagine are the most highly rated speakers now? Or who is even just highly rated?
Matketo, Hadar, Roman. I'm not gonna say Nikki because he's here. I don't know. David Africa, maybe.
Yeah,
so apparently.
Let's add Nikki to the conversation. Why not?
Yeah, so the way I would phrase that is, for anyone who would tell you any of these people are incredible, will win every round, will crush any debater, anyone who tells you that is overrating that specific speaker. Who exactly is the ones who are most highly overrated? You probably just named a bunch of them. But at the same time, there'll be other people who rate them badly or will not rate them significantly highly enough. But yeah, I think they're all probably going to be overrated by some people to some degree.
Yeah, I think that's you already mentioned this, but obviously the most recent world finalists and people who perform well will be overrated in certain levels, maybe because of rep bias, maybe because of other things. That's kind of part of the game. Moving on to the interesting question. Who is the greatest debaters of all time and why is it Harish?
Let's ask that second bit of this first. You know, don't want to sound egotistical, but here's the one thing I will say, which is one of the questions is for almost every very successful debater is how would they do in other circumstances? And that works in two ways, which is how would you do if you were speaking with someone else, particularly at major tournaments. And for many speakers, we actually don't have many data points related to that. And the reason I think we have to ask that question is you can be brilliant with a certain speaker. Maybe that's because prep works really well. Maybe that's because they are contributing a lot to your case, but won't work very well with a different kind of speaker. I think that always creates a distortion in the way in which we assess people. And I'm not alone in this, but so I've won, so let's say 7 major tournaments, which is the LSE Open 3 times, Oxford, Cambridge, Euros, HWS with 7 different speakers, got a world final with another, world semi with another, which I think is broadly my claim to being amongst those greatest speakers of all time. Plus, I think a level of consistency. And here I think is one of the important questions we ask when it comes to who are the greatest, which is, do we mean in any single round who could give the best speech? And the answer for me for that one is probably Shenwu Li, which is at his absolute best, he is near impossible to beat. And one of the reasons I actually think that about Shenwu is I spoke with him in the tournament. I've never walked into prep and had someone think so much faster than me. To the point where he was telling me what to say when I was speaking second, because his first to be dealt with in the first 30 seconds. The man's mind is phenomenal. And then you could just see what he comes out with. And there is certainly a view of him which goes, his arguments are now just so dated. Anyone could do them. Let me say this. No one could give those arguments even now the way Shenwu did. Maybe you give them a bit more analytical depth than before, but give him 3 hours, he would be able to do that better than almost anyone else at his peak. But he would sometimes miss debates as well. And he could give more of those 90s than almost anyone else. He will give those 79's lowest speeches if you judged it correctly, but obviously you add 3 extra marks for rep. So, that's true about that kind of speaker. Dan Le Havre, also definitively there, and probably actually I think what Alek said is probably the core issue here, which is he shifted what we cared about and thought debating was more than maybe any other speaker did. And that is huge in terms of what his actual achievements were. But at the same time, there are flaws in what he did, which means he can't be definitively the top person on that list, which is sometimes one of the consequences is there were very bad Dan rounds. I remember him talking to me about these sports rounds which he ran, and just listening to it, my mind exploding as to the insanity of these arguments he was running. And then other rounds, you listen to what he said and went, wow, that is utterly brilliant, which is a way of saying the way he debated changed everything, and he was brilliant at doing so. He is incredibly intelligent. But at the same time, there were flaws in that. Partially, there are going to be more knowledge gaps. And partially, one of the consequences of when you spend a lot of your speeches weighing material is sometimes the quality of the argumentation may not be as good as other speakers at the absolute highest level when it comes to all-time debaters. And that's a trade-off, which might be entirely plausible, though, the lack of knowledge in sports debates, less so. Those would be 2 of them on the list. I've already highlighted that MDG would definitively have to be up there, almost by the fact I feel I have to say that. But I actually think my comment about him is fair, which is he has the best command of language of almost any debater, which is efficiency and the ability to make you believe something when he was on point would be incredible, though the amount of arguments he would construct and the depth of those would not necessarily be as good as some of the other speakers. And if we really ask the question, which is underlying all this, some people say there are multiple answers, there are the GOATs in different categories. It's kind of evading this question, which is neutral judging, whatever that means. Who do you think would win if you had 10 debates, flipping between partners, who would win the most? And I think I probably would.
Alek, what do you think about that?
So, I have Harish number 3 on my all-time list. I think he has a very good argument for being number 2 also. Depends on which day you ask me. But I noticed that, and this is what I want to ask you maybe before I say my thing necessarily, is You didn't say anybody post 2016, and I was wondering, is this a sort of change of perspective of how you see debating, or do you just think these guys chopped liver, they're no good, all these things?
I don't think it follows that I said any of these people are anyone post 2016 is no good. And actually, something which is worth highlighting here. When we think about Dan, I'm thinking about 2018 Dan Lahav as utterly phenomenal. And I think what we're really talking about is when we talk about the quality of debating, it's really weird to go, when we're talking about the GOAT, does that actually suggest how good an era is? And I don't think it actually does, right? And that I think it just suggests how good a single individual was, and they can easily be an anomaly over a period of. They could be an anomaly, which is there'll be one person who's actually just that good, and the rest of the circuit could be terrible. They could still be utterly terrible. They could still be, and the rest of the circuit could be utterly terrible. This person could be the best of all time. I guess there's also other people I could include on the list, and just to highlight one thing, which I should actually say explicitly, which is the circuit I have the least experience of or knowledge of is Australia. And there are some phenomenal Australian speakers, but I've seen the least of them, so I'm not including them on the list. But, just to state who some of those people are, it's people like L. Jones, who people mentioned, people like V. Prowse, go back, Tim Sonreich, Tim Mooney, brilliant speakers. I just haven't seen enough of them to actually put them on that list. So that's worth putting as a caveat, which is everything is impacted by who we see and how often we see them, which may impact the fact that since 2018, none of the people on that list, but actually a few of them would be on the top 10. At the fine, you're going to ask me specifically who they are. At his best, look, Chin Wei would absolutely be on that list. In terms of his understanding of debating, Jason would be on that list. I think there's an argument that on that list, in 2 years, we won't have a difficulty with saying Matt Cato shifted the nature of debating and could be on that list, or Naomi could end up being on that list, or Hadar could end up being on that list, but they're not currently at the very top of it.
Yeah, I haven't seen the prisoner Australian speakers either so much, so I can't say. But maybe to be more specific, more spicy in this sort of way, no Tech Weitan mentioned at any point when listing your top speakers. Elaborate.
Tech is brilliant. He is not the greatest of all time, but he is certainly a great, great, great speaker. And here's the thing about Tech's. I told him this to his face. So I'll say this, which is, I remember when I first saw Tech's debate a lot, which was at a tournament before Dutch Worlds, and I think I gave him 285s, and it was below his average at the tournament. He was phenomenal. And what was phenomenal did was argument construction. It would layer it and make it so nuanced in what he was doing. Then Tex, I think, took part of the wrong lesson from Dan Lahav, which is do much more framing and less argument building. And he's still phenomenal at doing that, but I think lost what was making him, in my mind, at that stage, so close to being, had he continued down that trajectory, could easily be on that list. As it is, he's probably that top 10-ish, but not at the very top of it. I'm actually not sure he would disagree with that bit of the assessment. Maybe would disagree with my comment about the change in the nature of his debating. Oh, and of course I have to mention Ashish, also utterly brilliant.
Yeah, I think we can spend talking so much about this particular topic. At the end of these shows, what I like to do is I give the platform back to our guests. So you don't have a time limit, you don't have any constraints. The floor is yours for this particular time.
I don't know if I have a great deal more to say. I mean, I think what are the underlying parts of this conversation? I think it's what Nikki said, which is there are great debaters in all eras, and no one ends up being great unless there are at least two things which occur. First, that you realize when you're bad. And that's actually something which I've noticed often people don't realize, that I lose debates because of motions. I lose debates because of judges. Obviously true. You could get that 71, you could blame that judge. But here's the thing. You are probably also bad. And the only way to become better is start with realize when you aren't good and when you absolutely need to improve and the things which you need to improve on. And I think often people think of this as personal criticisms to say, you weren't good in this round, or this speaker score is what I gave you, and that's about as good as you actually are. But all of that is, you are bad, you can become better. And recognizing that is, to me, one of the most important things for debaters to do. And often I think this is something which lots of debaters fail to do. It's like, we were always screwed. You weren't, you were probably bad. Become better, realize it, and that's a first step to any level of improvement. And that's true at any level of debating, right? Which is, you lost because you weren't as good as you could be. And I always feel like the perfect mindset to be in. And so what I tell all of my World Schools kids, which is, you need to get to the stage where you realize you are good enough to beat anyone, but you are not so good, even at the top, that you can't become significantly better. Because to me, that's the only way that you actually become good at an activity, which you probably care a huge amount about. I always feel like the one thing which I want to give to people or tell them about, not as a personal criticism, realize when you are bad, realize when you have screwed up, and realize you can become so much better than you actually are if you're willing to put the effort in. If you're not, absolutely fine as well. But it is something which is in most people's capabilities, and what I try to tell everyone who debates.
I couldn't think of a better way to end this podcast, honestly. Harish, thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you so much for uh, taking off your time to have these chats. It means a lot to me as a person, if not to the audience, which I think is going to be fairly interested in this conversation. Also, thank you, Alek, for making this a spicy thumbnail for sure, but also I think you are definitely one of the most underrated debaters, but I'm sure that's going to change very, very soon, especially if you take that last advice that Harish gave at the end of this podcast.
I am that, I
Specific,
know
specifically, yeah, that is to you. You are also very good, but you are still much worse than you probably think you are and can become.
So, to everybody that's watching, uh, fuck it, I don't know, do the follow, subscribe thing. Who the fuck cares at this point if you're listening to this? But yeah, I mean, apparently I am good at convincing people that there is nothing better to do than chat about nerdy debate stuff. If I get Harish, who else might I get next? We don't know. The only way to find out is if you stay connected. That was it for this week.